Hi guys, so we're going to be talking about the endocrine system. In this lecture, we're going to compare endocrine and exocrine glands. We're going to look at how endocrine glands regulate through mechanisms like negative feedback. We're going to compare steroid and non-steroidal hormones and how they work. And we're going to look at the anterior pituitary gland. And so let's start with comparing the nervous system and the endocrine system. The nervous system was one of the systems that essentially helps to regulate our body. But as you will know, basically the endocrine system is responsible for that too. And so when we were talking about the nervous system, we had things such as neurons here that basically conduct impulses and then communicate to effector organs through neurotransmitters. Right? They're released from the synapse. They will diffuse across the synaptic cleft and go to postsynaptic cells, and you'll see a response there. How the endocrine system works is essentially we'll have these glandular cells, and they get secreted into the bloodstream. And the bloodstream is essentially the medium used to transfer those signaling molecules to its target cell. And the target cell essentially will recognize them. They'll have basically receptors on them for whatever hormone gets released, and that's how they'll respond to them. If the cells don't have the actual hormone receptor on it, there won't be any effect on them. So essentially, endocrine gland or the endocrine system and the nervous system have some similarities that they both transmit signals to target cells. Okay. Like I said, the endocrine system is different because instead of using neurotransmitters, they use hormones. So what is a hormone? Essentially what it is, it's a chemical signal or substance. And it's made by the endocrine system, right? That uses the bloodstream to reach a target cell for which it will bind its receptor to basically signal a change. Okay. And so let's talk about the different functions of the endocrine system here. So first, it's important because it helps to regulate metabolism. It can help to control the rate of certain chemical reactions. It can help to aid in transporting substances through membranes. It helps to, which we've already talked about before, regulate water balance. It also is there to help regulate electrolyte balance, which it goes hand in hand with water balance. It helps to regulate blood pressure. It's important in reproduction. In development, and for growth. So these are overarching topics, and essentially what we're going to do is, as we go through later in this lecture, we're going to talk about certain hormones that are responsible for these varying functions. Now, there are a couple different types of glands that the endocrine system uses. You have endocrine glands that are basically ductless glands, and they're going to secrete hormones straight into the bloodstream, where exocrine glands actually use duct to move their secretions to a surface, and that surface can be on the outside of our skin or somewhere inside our body. So end for inside, or ender, or X for kind of exit, right? And so enters the bloodstream, right? And exits ducts is how I remember the two types. Now, there are other types of glands that our body has. There are what are known as paracrine glands. And basically, these help to secrete their substance, and these are not hormones. Into what's known as interstitial fluid. And they transmit signals to local areas only. So on here, examples of paracrine gland signaling is clotting factors get released this way. Somatostatins are released this way. Histamine. And prostaglandins. Another common gland type are autocrine. And this you can think like autobiography about self, right? These secrete a substance, and that only affects the secreting cell. And so these, which we'll talk about a little bit later, are things like cytokine, interleukin-1, or things like T cells. So paracrine and autocrine are other types of glands outside of the endocrine system glands that we're going to focus on. And so this kind of shows you two examples here. The thyroid gland is an example of the endocrine gland, and this is going to release kind of like things like T4 or T3 into the blood system and allow them to go and flow through those highways to get to the effector cells. Where here you're looking something like, here is an eccrine sweat gland, where basically this exocrine gland, it's a duct, and so these cells release that substance into that middle area and basically release out the their material out to an external surface. And this can also happen internally as well. So these are the major locations of endocrine glands in the body. As you can see, and we looked when you were in the nervous system, you can see the pineal gland towards the back of the diencephalon area. The hypothalamus, which is the diencephalon, is underneath the thalamus there in the brain. Pituitary gland is at the bottom, or that base. Remember, you could find it in the sella turcica in the skull. And then you have the thyroid, which is the large part, and the small dots that you can see in there is the parathyroid gland. And that's on the dorsal aspect of the thyroid gland. Farther down is the thymus. The adrenal glands are located right on top of the kidneys. The pancreas is this large, thin-shaped organ that kind of looks like cauliflower. And then in female, you have the ovaries here, and in males, you have the testes. So you should be able to know the location of all these different glands. And what we're going to end up doing is looking at what these different glands do. Now, hormones work through two types of mechanisms. And so they act at receptors in one of two ways. And it all depends on their location. So the first is the second messenger system. And these are normally water-soluble hormones. And these essentially are proteins. And these things are really, they're really big. So they're going to act on receptors in the plasma membrane. They're not going to be able to get through the plasma membrane, right? And essentially, they're going to start acting via a second messenger, which means they're going to activate something on the inside of the cell so that something else can do the job. So a big part of these is the fact that they can't enter the cell. So this would be the idea is if I came and knocked on a door and I couldn't actually come through the door, like they open just the top part of the door, right? And it's like absolutely nobody's allowed to come in here. Or maybe it's the idea that, honestly, the door is just too small for me to get through. So whoever opens the door that I encounter, I'm going to give them the message. And so that's kind of like those membrane receptors. And so they're going to grab the message, and then they're going to give it to their floor runner on the inside. And that floor runner, the person that got the door, is going to tell the floor runner, listen, go give this to maybe Karen in receiving or marketing or whatever. And so that person runs over to Karen. That's what the second messenger's like. And then ends up giving the message to Karen, right? So that's how a second messenger system works. Direct gene activation is exactly like it says in the title. It's direct. So these guys are lipid-soluble hormones. So it's things like thyroid hormones and steroids. If you remember, steroids are essentially derivatives of cholesterol, and cholesterol are essentially found in the lipid bilayer, and lipids are fats, right? So anything that can go through that are basically nonpolar molecules. And so these work on intracellular receptors because they can enter the cell. And so let's look at pictures of these really quick. And so this is the second messenger, right? And so what happens here is this protein molecule here. The protein molecule binds to that receptor on the cell membrane. And it activates the signaling molecule. So on here, right, you'll see that this guy, this G protein, gets activated, and this G protein comes over here to what's known as adenylate cyclase. And that protein right here is going to activate cyclic AMP. Sounds a lot like ATP, right? The difference is this is adenosine monophosphate, And our energy molecule is adenosine triphosphate, so it only has one phosphate here, and it's circular. So basically, this activates cyclic AMP, which is a signaling molecule. And so this second messenger comes down here and activates what's known as a protein kinase. And protein kinases just help to put phosphate groups on things, which make them active. And this is what's going to trigger a response. So if you look at this picture here, it kind of shows you, it's kind of like people that are running and giving the different stick along in kind of like a relay team. That the hormone comes in, binds this protein. That protein has another protein attached to it, which gets activated, moves across the membrane to bind to this adenylate cyclase, which is an enzyme. That takes ATP and changes it into the second messenger, the signaling molecule, adenosine triphosphate. And then that is going to basically activate whatever this targeting response of the cell, right? Whether it activates an enzyme, stimulates a secretion, opens a channel, something. This is basically the effect that this whole signaling cascade is having. And this is all because this guy right here cannot cross the membrane. That being said, let's look at direct gene activation. So here we have a steroid. This is a nonpolar molecule, much like a lipid. So it can pass easily through the membrane. And then what's going to happen is this steroid hormone is going to come in contact with the actual receptor in the cell. Once this complex comes together, it can easily go through that pore in the nucleus. It's called the nuclear membrane, right? And then once it gets in here, this receptor hormone complex will bind the actual DNA region. That is going to initiate transcription. If you remember, that's DNA going to RNA, right? And then once messenger RNA gets made and it becomes basically mature and it's ready to leave, it's going to go out of the nucleus and then be translated into a protein. So that's what's causing the change here. So direct gene activation means that it can directly work where the second messenger system uses a relay system for this kind of stuff to happen because the hormone isn't big enough to get in. So those are the main two forms of basically mechanisms for which hormones act. So how are hormones released? What controls them? And essentially, the concentration of hormones in the blood gets controlled by a process known as negative feedback. And so this varies only within a very narrow region, and it makes it so that it stays within a desirable range. So negative feedback, if you remember, is the idea that, for instance, we talked about it when we talked about temperature, right? And so if you are basically cold, right, there are temperature, actually, let me do this. Let's talk about what negative feedback is in relationship to what we already know. There you go. So what we already know here is about temperature. And so you have some kind of stimulus and say maybe this is when the temperature drops, right? And you have basically temperature sensitive cells. that detect this change, right? And so they talk to the control center, which is your brain, right? Specifically the hypothalamus of your brain. And it says, oh, heck, we are getting too cold. So it talks to an effector cell, which here would be your muscles, to make you shake, right? Because you shaking when you're cold makes your muscles work, and there is unused energy in the form of heat that gets released that helps to increase your temperature in your body. Now, once you get warm enough, those same temperature sensing cells will sense that the temperature has now gotten higher, right? That's the next stimulus. And so it will talk to the control center and say, hey, we are hot, right? And so if you get hot at this point, it's going to talk to basically things like your sweat glands to release water, right? So the idea of negative feedback is once you get high enough in something, it turns it off and wants to flip it back, the opposite of what it is, right? So it kind of helps with making sure things don't get too high or too low. It's a really good way of balancing it. Where if you remember positive feedback, and a perfect example of using positive feedback is labor pain. Basically, you get a little bit oxytocin released, and that helps to start the contractions for labor. Well, your contractions, once you get high enough, do not get less, right? That will activate for it to increase more oxytocin so that you can get more labor contractions, and that keeps happening until the baby is had. So the response never gets reduced in positive feedback. So you can think positive more and more and more. Or negative feedback, it gets reduced. So it's the idea, a lot of times, say you have one gland up here that releases, I'm going to put hormone 1. And then hormone 1 is going to go down here to another gland. And that is going to help release hormone 2. And then hormone 2 goes to the final gland. Right? And that one is going to release hormone 3. Now, this is going to be in the bloodstream, and you're going to keep making it because you're still going to keep getting gland number 1, reducing hormone 1, to go to gland number 2 so it can reduce hormone 2 to go to the final gland. And what will happen in negative feedback is that once we get too much of this, it'll come over here. It'll bind to this gland 1 and turn off hormone 1. Because now we have enough of hormone 3. So that's negative feedback. Hopefully you figure out negative as once we have enough here, we want to turn it off. So that's how it works, or negative feedback works. Now, endocrine glands are stimulated to make, right, and release hormones in response to both what's known as humoral stimuli, neural stimuli, or hormonal. So let's talk about all three. So humoral stimulus, pardon me, works this way. So in here, the example here that they go is that this is basically the hormone is going to get released due to some kind of body substance being off. So the stimulus in this example is we have low calcium in our blood capillaries. so that the parathyroid then will release parathyroid hormone, will help increase calcium levels. So this is the idea that a body substance acts as a signaling molecule and will bind a signal receptor to notify a control center that releases hormones. That will activate an effector to bring about change, right? And so in this example, you start activating things like osteoclast to start breaking down bones to release that calcium into the blood, right? So a humoral stimulus is basically a body substance that will activate hormone release. This is basically a neural stimulus, is that you're getting signals detected in the central nervous system. That can activate endocrine glands that will cause a secretion of the hormone. So basically, this idea right here is that you're getting action potentials generated in the spinal cord of the central nervous system in these preganglionic sympathetic fibers that activate onto the adrenal gland. And then basically the adrenal medulla cells will then secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. So this is the stimulus is coming from nervous system. And then hormonal stimulus is the idea that the stimulus that's activating hormone secretion is coming from another hormone. So here, a lot of times, the anterior pituitary gland is going to be responsible for generating hormones that go to the thyroid, the adrenal cortex, or the gonads, the testes, right? Here is an example. And so, essentially, there's a part of the brain that's called the hypothalamus that is also a big part of the endocrine system that likes to talk to the anterior pituitary gland. But the hormonal stimulus, because stimulus is what activates something, right? So this is where the hormone is actually secreted by an endocrine gland, and that is going to activate another gland somewhere else. So those are the three main types of stimulus that you find that activates the endocrine system. Now, so when we're looking at control of hormone, there is a master in the endocrine system. And that master essentially is the anterior pituitary gland, right? So we essentially have the hypothalamus, which kind of helps to regulate basic autonomic functions in our body. And so it releases a neurotransmitter and talks to the pituitary gland. Now, there's two parts of the pituitary gland. There is what's known as the anterior pituitary gland, and then there's also what's known as the posterior pituitary gland. And for the most part, the posterior helps to kind of store certain hormones, and the anterior pituitary gland is responsible for releasing or stimulating hormones that stimulates other endocrine glands, okay? And from there, you can get physiological changes such as growth, maturation, reproduction, metabolism, and behavior from there. So basically, when we talk about this, the master of the endocrine system is the anterior pituitary gland. So let's talk about some of when gland activity results in diseases, right? And so this can come from either producing too much, which is hyperactive glands. And so if your endocrine gland is overstimulated, it may produce or secrete an excess amount of hormone. And basically, this may be caused by a hypertrophic gland or by a glandular tumor, right? Hypoactivity is when you get not enough of the gland, so it's failing to secrete the hormone in adequate amounts. And so this may be caused by disease or tumor, and it may be caused by something like trauma where the cells are malfunctioned or not working at all anymore, surgery, or radiation. And so a lot of diseases that we see that are a result of endocrine malfunctions is because either the gland is producing too much or not enough. And that's the reason why this negative feedback loop is so important. And so the anterior pituitary gland is the first one that we're going to focus on here. And the hormones from this gland control functions of many other endocrine glands, like I was saying earlier, as well as it plays a direct role on body systems. And so let's talk about what some of these hormones do. So the first one, hormones that control other endocrine glands, right? And so the first one is TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. What do you think that guy, which endocrine gland do you think it's going to activate? Hopefully you said thyroid gland, right? Adrenocorticotropic hormones, or ACTH, will stimulate what? Hopefully you looked at here and said the adrenal gland. Follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, or luteinizing hormone are both in basically reproduction. So follicle stimulating hormone, what do you think that has to do with? Hopefully you said something in regards to the ovaries and the testes. So it helps with the development of the follicles and the ovaries. So hopefully you realize ovaries are for females. And that it stimulates the production of sperm in the testes. And that's of male. Luteinizing hormone, or LH, again, we're looking at reproduction. So it stimulates ovulation in the female ovaries, right? And production of the progesterone. Now, to help with men in kind of reproduction, luteinizing hormone helps with stimulating the production of testosterone. And this happens in basically the testes to maintain sperm production. Now, the hormones that stimulate bodily systems is growth hormone. That helps with cell metabolism and growth. And this is essentially specifically when we're talking about cell metabolism. It's in growth of bones and muscles. And we're going to talk a little bit here in a second what can happen whenever those kind of go awry. And then prolactin is a lactogenic hormone. So this helps to stimulate milk production. And that's in the mammary glands. And so let's really quick here talk about some of what can happen when growth hormone goes awry. So, whenever you have what's known as acromegaly, this is a condition where you get an increase in growth hormone. But this is during adulthood. So if you look at this picture of this young woman throughout her life, right? And so on here you can see as a child and even as a young woman that a lot of her features are essentially very much controlled and look typical. But as she ages, there is a change that you're starting to see. So this condition is basically will cause an enlargement of soft tissue like the nose and the tongue. And so as you can see, as she's aging, her nose is getting much bigger, a thickening of the jaw. You can see as a child or even as a young lady that it's not as thick, but then if you look here at her jawline as she's gotten older, it's become much, much increased and thickening. So this is what happens when you get an increase in growth hormone during adulthood. Now, there are situations where that we are more used to is with growth hormone during childhood. So if you get too little growth hormone during childhood, this is where it becomes pituitary dwarfism. And this is a very small stature and structure. And then if you get too much growth hormone during childhood, you get giantism. So dwarfism or giantism is something that happens because of the fact that you're getting growth hormone during those times for which your bones are getting longer. After a certain age, growth hormone is not going to cause an increase in stature as you're older, because if you remember from the ossification of bones and longitudinal growth, the growth plate basically somewhere between the age of 18 and 21 fuses, and you no longer get that elongation anymore. So this is the reason why you start seeing these particular phenotypes happening as you age. The things that can get bigger will get bigger, and those are limited. So negative feedback for the pituitary gland and how it works is basically what you have here is you can get when we're looking at here and we're looking at thyroid gland, this is a good example that is relevant to negative feedback. And so you have the hypothalamus that will communicate to the anterior, pituitary gland here. The pituitary gland will release thyroid stimulating hormone. Basically, the thyroid will receive that hormone through a receptor, and that will activate it to make thyroid hormone. And this will go to the target cell that it needs to. At that point, though, this is being released into the bloodstream. So if it reaches the anterior pituitary gland or parts in the hypothalamus, it's going to inhibit. And once the levels are high enough to completely turn it off, then it'll happen. Once those levels fall, it's not going to be there to block the activity anymore. So then this will start becoming stimulated again. So that's just a review on how it works. Now, the posterior pituitary gland is a little bit different. This guy's a little atypical of a endocrine gland, is that it consists of nerve fibers and neuroglial cells with specialized secretory granules in it. And so here, what they release are two. It's antidiuretic hormone, or vasopressin, and oxytocin. As you guys already know, antidiuretic hormone, and think of the word diuretic, you might have taken those yourself at some point or know someone who has. It helps to maintain the body's water level or water balance. And it does it by increasing water absorption in the kidneys. So basically, a deficit of this will result in diabetes insipidus. Now, this is essentially regulated by negative feedback. And so there are what's known as osmoreceptors throughout the body that whenever the amount of salt that there is lower than it should be, or kind of hypotonic, it notifies that a hypothalamus to change the amount of osmotic pressure signals that are there to release the amount of to release or inhibit the amount of antidiuretic hormone. So diabetes insipidus is just kind of this disorder that happens due to alterations in salt and water metabolism. And so essentially what you have there is you end up getting this whole intense thirst and heavy urination because it's not able to produce enough antidiuretic hormone. There's an inadequate output of this, so it causes you to urinate excessively and always be thirsty. And so that's why your posterior, one of the reasons why your posterior pituitary gland is so important, because water levels in your body are extremely important along with salt or ion levels. Now, oxytocin is one thing that gets released. It stimulates contractions of smooth muscles in the wall of the uterus and contractions of cell and the mammary glands for lactation. And of course, this is positive feedback, so it enhances the stimulus. Oxytocin is also known as the cuddle hormone to help with bonding between people. It gets released after sex and for children and their parents. Thyroid gland. You need a small amount of iodine to produce the hormone. It used to be a big problem, especially in some of the third world countries still. And a lack of iodine can result in goiters, and these are really large. And you can see this child here has a goiter right here, and so this is an enlargement of the thyroid. We don't really have problems with it in this country anymore because of the fact that we add we add something to something we always eat. We add iodine to something that we always eat. Does anybody know what this is? Salt. Morton salt. They ionize salt in this country. Now, if you're getting something like sea salt or any of the specialized salts, they don't do that. But the one that you get, just typical table salt that you get, actually has a small amount of iodine into it. And so there's two things. There's thyroxine, T4, and triiodothyronine, which is T3. And both of these hormones help to regulate metabolism of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. So a lack of thyroid hormone, which is called hypothyroidism, can cause you to be really tired and help you accumulate fluids. Hyperthyroidism is a production of it, can cause extreme nervousness, fatigue, and it actually elevates the rate of your body metabolism. And both of these work by negative feedback again. Once they're a high enough level in the body, they'll turn off the anterior pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. Calcitonin hormone is also released from the thyroid gland, and it helps to promote uptake of calcium by the bones from the bloodstream. Now, parathyroid gland helps, and we talked about this a couple times already throughout the year. It stimulates the osteoclast to digest bone matrices. And basically, that thyroid hormone gets released into the bloodstream and will activate those osteoclasts in the bone. They will chomp down the bone and release calcium. It also helps with the enhancement of reabsorption of calcium and secretion of phosphate by the kidneys, and it will help to promote activation of vitamin D by kidneys, which increases absorption by calcium in the actual intestines. This again is controlled by negative feedback. Rising calcium levels will inhibit parathyroid hormone to be released. And so this shows you the picture right here. If you have hypocalcemia, and you can remember hypocalcemia looks like calcium in there, right? And so if you have low blood calcium levels, it's going to release parathyroid hormone, and that acts in three ways. Activates osteoclasts to start chomping away the calcium phosphate in the bones, and it's going to release calcium to help increase those levels, as well as phosphates. It helps increase the reabsorption in the kidney tubules of calcium, and an increased activation of vitamin D, which helps to increase calcium reabsorption of food in the small intestines. All of these together will help rise calcium blood levels. Once this gets to a sufficient degree, it is going to inhibit parathyroid hormone release from the parathyroid by negative feedback. So what can happen if you have an imbalance of parathyroid hormone? Well, hyperparathyroidism is generally due to tumors, and because you are essentially, look here, back here, increasing so much, a big problem you have to look at it is what's going to happen here, right? So these going to cause discomfort, but this guy right here is going to be a huge problem. So that's the reason why you start seeing a problem in bone softening, deformation, and breaks, and things of that nature. If you go back here, it's going to be discomfort, because if you have a lot of calcium phosphate forming in your kidneys, then that's going to lead to structures solidifying and becoming kidney stones. It can also depress nervous system functions as well. Hypoparathyroidism normally happens whenever you damage the gland, or you remove some part of the gland, or you have a reduction in dietary magnesium. And this can really result in tetany, which is the constant muscle or contractions or activations of contractions, respiratory paralysis, and death. So calcium levels are very, very, very important to be maintained in both your body and in levels just in your blood and in your bones. The adrenal glands, these are pyramid-shaped organs atop the kidney, right? Structurally and functionally are two glands in one. You have the adrenal medulla, and this is basically nervous tissue, and it's part of the sympathetic nervous system. This essentially is going to basically talk back and forth with the adrenal cortex, which is a 3-layer of basically endocrine tissue that helps to synthesize and secrete corticosteroids. Both glands that we look at have a role in stress. So let's talk about the gland, the adrenal medulla first, and what hormones are produced there. And so we have the adrenal medulla that essentially is responsible for the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. And so epinephrine helps to stimulate or increase blood glucose levels. It helps with bronchial dilation and increases blood flow to skeletal muscles and heart. Norepinephrine is going to basically influence peripheral vasoconstriction, so the reduction in the diameter of blood vessels and blood pressure, right? And so this is important in the idea of fight and flight. When we look at the adrenal cortex, it's responsible for releasing aldosterone. We've talked about this before. It helps to stimulate sodium reabsorption and water retention, eliminating potassium. Cortisol, which helps to stimulate cell metabolism, keeps blood glucose levels relatively constant, helps maintain blood pressure by increasing the action of vasoconstriction, so making those blood vessels smaller, and it kind of suppresses inflammatory response. And androgens are important with basically it's a male sex hormone, and that's produced in both men and women, and it helps to onset. It promotes the beginning of puberty and secondary sexual characteristics. Secondary sexual characteristics are all those characteristics on the outside that help us determine if something is male or female. So what we look like, right? It makes it easier to mate when you have secondary sexual characteristics, because you can walk down the street and go, okay, this person, by the looks of what they look like on the outside, are going to have ovaries, or this person is going to have sperm. Imagine if we all had the characteristics of just men or just women, and how hard it would be to determine if somebody has ovaries or testes. So we end up having to, that's how that occurs. Now, what we have to watch out a lot of times when we're talking about this is there are different types of stress. So this adrenal gland and stress go hand in hand, right? And so the sympathetic nervous system is basically our fight or flight response that gets activated by the adrenal medulla gland. And basically what's going to happen here is you have things like, you have different kinds of stress overall, right? You have physical stress that you can get. This is caused, and unfortunately I can't write this down, guys, because my computer just malfunctioned. So if you have to pause it as we're going through here, that's fine, just to give you the heads up. Essentially what happens though, oh, maybe I got it back. Let me see. See what happens here. There are different types of stress. There's physical stress that can be caused by extreme cold or heat, a decrease in oxygen levels, infection, injury, prolonged heavy exercise, and loud sounds. But we know physical stress is not the only kind of stress there is. There's also psychological stress. So physical, get it to work again, and psychological, right? And psychological stress is caused by danger, personal loss, unpleasant interactions, and just certain feelings overall. And so your body takes both of these and adapts to it. The problem is whenever you have just short-term stress is not going to be completely detrimental to your body. Short-term stress is normal. A bear is running at you. You need to get away. You're cold outside. You have, one exam that's coming up and, it's not something you generally have to do. Or, you're about to get married. And so all of these things work through release. And so short-term stress response is, your heart rate can increase, blood pressure increases, your bronchioles dilate, open up to help get more oxygen if you need it. The liver is going to convert glycogen, which is a stored molecule, to glucose so that you can run away, right, if you need to. Blood flow changes, reduces digestive system, because if you're having to run from a bear, it's not very important that you are digesting your food or that you pee, so it reduces urine output. Metabolic rates can increase. So all of this is going to help in a temporary moment protect you. The problem is when you end up having prolonged stress. And this can lead to something known as an adrenal adaptation syndrome. This is also known as general stress syndrome. And so your body reacts to stress this way. Essentially, you have your hypothalamus that initiates a fight or flight response. And that is basically in response to the sympathetic nervous system. And this is going to basically activate the adrenal medulla, right? And you're going to release things like basically catecholamines, which are epinephrine and norepinephrine, and you'll get all of this, right? But it also releases over here, if you can see, corticotropic releasing hormones. And this is in the adrenal cortex, right? And all of these, especially long-term stress response, kidney retains sodium and water, blood volume and blood pressure rises, proteins and fats get converted to glucose and broken down for energy, blood glucose increases, the immune system gets suppressed. So if you're constantly under a state of stress, it can slowly break down your body. And that's because in short-term stress response, it's doing these things to keep you alive and to protect you from a bear. But at some point, your body, if it constantly thinks that you are in these detrimental situations for which you need to escape, then it's going to do all of these things. Which is the reason why, guys, when you are constantly stressed out from school and you're taking too much on, you feel like you're getting sick or easier. Or your parents may be working their butt off at work and then they start having high blood pressure problems. Your body cannot distinguish and say, oh, there's no reason to worry. This is just a test. Between, oh, there's a bear chasing me. It kind of produces some of the same responses. So we really have to be careful in how we react to those. Adrenal gland imbalances, if you get hypersecretion, you can get what's known as Cushing's syndrome. And so you can get where your cartilage starts to depress and bone formation isn't working quite right. You get inflammation that it inhibits the inflammatory response, depresses the immune system, and disrupts the cardiovascular, neural, and gastrointestinal functions. Hyposecretion, known as Addison's disease, basically is when you have a deficit in the mineral corticoids. So you get a decrease in glucose and sodium levels. This can cause weight loss, severe dehydration, and hypotension. So here's a perfect example of Cushing's syndrome. And you can see from here, the woman, you start getting this where you are having all this fat deposits going to these different areas, right? And so that arrow kind of shows you what's known as a buffalo hump of fat on the upper back. So this is kind of one of the ways that you can point to that you might be having Cushing's syndrome. Now the pineal gland, small gland, hanging from the roof of the third ventricle towards the back, right? Basically, they contain what are known as pinealocytes, and these secrete melatonin. And it's derived from serotonin. And melatonin affects basically sexual maturation and puberty, our day and night cycle when we're awake and when we're asleep. The rhythmic variations of body temperature, sleep, and appetite, and the production of antioxidants and detoxifying molecules in the cell. So the pineal gland is very, very important in helping us to feel good. The ovaries are important in producing estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen helps with maturation of the reproductive organs, and it's important for the secondary sexual characteristics for women. So breasts, wider hips, higher pitch voice, menstrual cycles. Progesterone is important in breast development and cyclic changes of the lining of the uterus. So menstrual cycles. Testosterone is important for the maturation of male reproductive organs, and it causes the secondary male sexual characteristics. So facial and chest hair, the deepening of the voice, and big muscles and broad shoulders. It's important in having an active sex drive, necessary for normal sperm production, and it helps to maintain reproductive organs in the functional sense in men. The thymus gland helps to produce thymosin, which is needed for the production and maturation of the white blood cells known as T lymphocytes. And we'll talk more about that later in the semester when we get to essentially the immunity. And the pancreas is important, and it secretes insulin and glucagon. Insulin is produced in beta cells in the pancreas, and essentially it helps to signal to the liver to convert glucose into glycogen. Glycogen is the storage molecule, so basically it's a bunch of glucose bind together. And so this is going to help blood glucose levels decrease. So after you eat, beta cells basically tell the liver, we have enough glucose, let's store it for later. It also is going to signal body cells to take up glucose. Glucagon is produced by the alpha cells in the pancreas. And this is when you have low blood glucose levels. It's going to tell the liver to convert that storage molecule we produced a moment ago, glycogen, into glucose so that we can help to maintain glucose levels in the body or in the blood. Pardon me. Both insulin and glycagon are negative feedbacks to stop the production under optimal blood glucose levels. And so this kind of gives us an idea of how it works. The stimulus, blood glucose levels increase. So the pancreas is going to detect that and release insulin. Insulin is both going to help the tissue cells actually take up glucose so that in the cells they can make ATP and go through metabolism or oxidative phosphorylation. But it's also going to tell the liver to take glucose and make it to the storage molecule glycogen. And so from there, because glucose is going into the cells and be converted to glycogen, the levels of glucose in the blood is going to go down. Now, once we get to unsafe levels of our too low blood glucose level, and so you see the average normal blood is about 90 milligrams per 100 mils. Once it gets too low, it's going to signal to the pancreas to release glucagon. And glucagon is going to say, hey, glycogen, break down to make glucose, and then be released into the blood. So this is how our body regulates blood glucose levels. So diabetes mellitus, DM, there are two types of this. There's type 1 and type 2. Essentially, blood glucose levels remain high in both types due to basically lack of insulin, type 1. So type 1 tends to be more juvenile diabetes where you're not making insulin correctly. And type 2 is normally what you get when you're overweight and you're older, insulin resistance. And this is when you're making the insulin, but it's not working correctly. Glycosuria is when basically glycosuria is when glucose actually spills into the urine. And for the longest time, when we didn't have urine tests, they figured out about diabetes because urine would actually taste sweet. And that's how they could determine, if somebody had this or that diabetes even existed in the first place. Now, if you can't get glucose, then sometimes fats can be used for cellular fuel. So this is lipidemia. If it's severe, it can make ketone or ketone bodies from fatty acid metabolism, and that can use to lead to ketonuria or ketoacidosis. So this is the idea that your body can't bring glucose into the cells because the insulin isn't there or the insulin isn't working right. So it starts breaking down everything in the body to try to look for glucose. The problem is it's not that there's no glucose there, it's that the body can't get it into the cells. So both of these problem with keto bodies, especially ketoacidosis, it will lead to the point of your blood becoming acidic, and if the pH is too skewed, it can start basically destroying other proteins. Untreated ketoacidosis can disrupt heart activity, O2 transport, depression of the nervous system, and coma and death is possible. So that's why it's very important that you control diabetes. And so we are finished with this for today, and we will be starting with blood and cardiovascular system next.